Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight. Thank you for attending this event. My name is Mara Vicenta, and I am Assistant Professor in Anthropology and Integrative Conservation here at William & Mary. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's discussion with Dr. Kim TallBear, titled Beyond Diversity, Inclusion, and Conservation to Decolonization in Science, Technology, and Policy. This event is part of the 2021-2022 Conservation Speaker Series focused on Indigenous voices in conservation and supported by the Institute for Integrative Conservation, the Anthropology Department, the History Department, the Center for Racial and Social Justice, and the American Indian Resource Centers and Native Studies minor. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands the William & Mary campus is on today. The Tironhaka, Noroway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mataponai, Monacan, Nensmont, Noroway, Pamunkey, Parawomek, Upper Mataponai, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members, past and present. For those of you who have just joined, my name again is Mara Vicenta, Assistant Professor at William & Mary, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Kim TallBear. She is a member of the Sisseton Wapton Oyate Dakota tribe in South Dakota. Dr. TallBear is Professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience and Society, Faculty of Native Studies at University of Alberta. She is the author of Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging, and the False Promise of Genetic Science. In addition to studying the genome science's disruptions to Indigenous self-definitions, Dr. TallBear studies colonial disruptions to Indigenous sexual relations. She is also a regular panelist on the weekly podcast, Media Indigena. Tonight, Dr. TallBear will help us explore the decolonial turn in conservation, addressing the differences between diversity, inclusion, and conservation, and decolonization. Dr. TallBear will discuss real-world transformations that researchers and Indigenous peoples are doing to decolonize science, technology, and training. Tonight's discussion will begin with Kim TallBear's talk and conclude with a Q&A session. We encourage questions from participants. To ask questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. All attendees' micros and videos will be turned off throughout the event. Tonight's event will be recorded, and we will be sending a follow-up email with a link to the recording and information about future events. Without any further delay, I leave the screen and welcome to Dr. Kim TallBear. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. Well, I guess we can move past my title and go to the next slide. So I'm just going to let you know where I'm coming from. It's great to be here, sort of. I am coming to you from Edmonton, Alberta, which is the second to the westernmost province in Canada. We're just to the east of British Columbia. You can go back to that. Yeah, that one. Thank you. And so Edmonton is known in Cree as Amiskatchewaskahigan, and that means Beaver Hills House. And this is Treaty 6 territory. So I have that little inset map because the treaties across Canada, across much of Canada, not all of it are numbered. And so we're in Treaty 6. The treaties between settlers and Indigenous peoples here. And that photograph is the North Saskatchewan River, which is right outside my window to my right. I took that picture last year, so it looks about like that now. This is a traditional and historical gathering place, and still today for a lot of different Indigenous peoples. So Cree are probably the main people here, and that's the language that we teach in my faculty. also Blackfoot, and they are all down into southern Alberta, and then across the Alberta border is Montana, where there are Blackfeet relatives down there. You say Blackfoot in Canada, Blackfeet in the US. I don't know why. We've also got Métis people here, Nakota, which are cultural kin to me as a Dakota person. So our peoples were all up in through here, as well as what is now Minnesota and the Dakotas in the US. Dene people, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and even Inuit people down here from the north. So that's where I am right now. So let's move to the next slide. It's quite cold here. It's like, I think it's like 25 below today or something. So I'm going to talk about basic ideas for about half of this talk, because I want to, there's terminology that's being thrown around a lot in the academy and in the fields that we're all working in science technology policy, Indigenous science, conservation, and environmentalism. And I think it'd be good to get on the same page about some of these terms, so we are using them in a really thoughtful and robust way. They tend to get used interchangeably. But before I get to terms like inclusion, diversity, and decolonization, I want to just talk about something that I think is taken for granted in the kind of science studies work that I do. And I am somebody who works with Indigenous scientists and Indigenous science policy experts, Indigenous communities who are interested in using science to govern. But I also have studied with and am in conversation with feminist scientists and feminist critics of science. And what I came to discover in my graduate work, not considering myself a feminist before I got to graduate school, and I should say before I did a PhD in my early to late 30s, I was an environmental planner and policy specialist for tribes, tribal organizations, and federal agencies. I am an American. I'm originally from the US. I've been up here about 7 years now. So when I got to graduate school and I started working with feminist scientists and feminist science studies scholars, I realized that they had a lot of the same critiques, productive critiques of science and technology fields, so of science and engineering. And one of those critiques is that there are really common masculinist hierarchies that are underlying the history of these fields and disciplines and their methods and the way that they approach what they call objectivity. And so feminist science studies scholars, some of you in this audience, this is old news to you. I think to some of the others, particularly undergraduate students, this might be new. I worked with a pretty well-known feminist science studies scholar in graduate school, Donna Haraway, who some of you have probably read. And so she's the person that calls this the God trick. And what she means by the God trick is this idea that there are some people who get to claim to be objective. And so there are these kinds of doctrines and ideas about objectivity in science. And there are ideas that some people are objective and some people are biased. And perhaps the closer you are to an issue, it makes you biased. It makes you unable to produce good, rigorous, objective knowledge. Well, what that perspective does is it has de facto, given the power relations in our settler colonial society, made particularly Indigenous people, women, children, non-humans, people that are not sexually normative, anybody who's considered deviant from the norm and what constitutes the norm, right? Those are the people who get studied and gazed at, and who gets to gaze at and study others. And I found this, always like to find visuals that sort of illustrate these complicated, seemingly complicated ideas. And I came across this visual, which will all recognize this pattern. You have white people, mostly men, sitting in a Land Rover, a kind of classic colonial explorer vehicle, probably in Africa, right? Gazing at, one can assume, the non-human wildlife or maybe even humans, right? But what you don't expect to see, what we rarely would see, would be a bunch of African people or a bunch of Indigenous people from the Americas gazing at the white subject. So imagine Indigenous people in a Land Rover in suburban Chicago taking images and studying white suburbanites. You don't expect to see that, right? So we have assumptions deeply built into our national cultures about who gets to gaze, take pictures of, study, and look at others, and who is viewed as the kind of biased, non-objective person who automatically gets studied. So Donna Haraway calls that the God trick, the idea being that God we think of as standing everywhere, but nowhere at the same time. God is disembodied. God sees everything from all vantage points, a kind of objectivity and all-seeingness. Let's go to the next slide. So that's kind of a common idea that animates some of these critiques of what's wrong with hierarchical and masculinist and white supremacist forms of science. And I'll say a lot more about that in detail. This is my co-director of a couple of programs I'm going to talk about in this talk, Jessica Kolopenik, who is from Peguis First Nation, which is Cree people. And I think there's Anishinaabe people within that First Nation too. Things work a bit different up here in terms of First Nation governance than they do with tribal governance in the US. But Peguis First Nation is in Manitoba near Winnipeg. And she is a political theorist and is co-directing our Indigenous Science Studies program, which we are forming that's both research and training and teaching in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. And in Canada, when you talk about a faculty, it's the same way you would talk about a college in the US. So you might have a College of Liberal Arts in the United States. We have a Faculty of Arts and we have a Faculty of Native Studies. We are the only Faculty of Native Studies in North America, meaning we have our own dean, our own building, and our own administration. This is why I'm here. It's the most extensive Native Studies program I've ever seen. And so one of the things that they recruited me to do was to center science and technology, policy, ethics, and governance within our Native Studies program, because nations govern in part through science, and Indigenous nations are no different. And I've seen this working on the ground as a tribal environmental planner. I've worked with a lot of tribal environmental scientists, and I saw that this was so important to exercising tribal jurisdiction and tribal sovereignty. We don't only go to court, we don't only train lawyers, we don't only build schools, but we need people on the ground doing environmental monitoring, for example, building environmental programs in order for us to govern our own territories and have jurisdiction. And so this is really key. And this is what I came to graduate school to study, because I'd already worked in the field. And now we're building this as at the center of our suite of Native Studies curricula and offerings. And Jess, this is a quote from her that kind of centers everything we're doing. She says, colonial ideas about race and reason have dually framed Indigenous peoples as objects of scientific curiosity and as political wards of state governance, not rational enough to produce valid knowledge or run real governments. And so this is the idea, right? We're the ones that get studied. Science happens to us. It's non-Indigenous scientists who study our lands. They have contracted in the 19th and even into the 20th century with people who are essentially grave robbers to take our bones. They have our blood and our DNA and deep freeze. They study us, right? We are the people who get studied. We have been considered legally wards of state governance. And so part of insisting that Indigenous people should do science is insisting on Indigenous governance and an assertion of tribal sovereignty and recovering Indigenous jurisdiction over our territories and populations. So let's go to the next slide. Let's see. I'm just trying to keep track of my time, Mara. So I think I started at about 4:20, and I'm going to assume I can go until about 5:05 then. And let me know if I'm getting close to that and you want me to wrap up, but I'll try to keep an eye on the clock. So this is just a picture of a symposium we held this year. I just want to give you a sense of the kind of people that are involved in this globally. So I don't only work with Indigenous peoples in the US and Canada, but I have worked with Indigenous peoples more globally. That said, the notion of Native studies or Indigenous studies and the whole concept of indigeneity tends to work better in settler colonial states. So this is one of the reasons that Indigenous studies, as we call it, is much more common and developed in the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. We are, and I'll talk about a project in a little bit, there are Indigenous peoples in other parts of the world that are kind of involved in this global Indigenous organizing. But in general, I have found in the audiences I've spoken to and the researchers I've worked with from, say, the continents of Africa and Asia, that indigeneity tends to be a bit more of a contentious category. And there may be peoples in those continents that we as North Americans would consider Indigenous, but they don't necessarily use that term. And so all that is to say that my Indigenous Science Studies Network is a bit biased for those kinds of contextual reasons towards countries where it tends to make more sense. to people because of settler colonialism. You kind of need a settler to have an indigenous population. So and the other thing that's been really interesting is the people who've been working on these global science, technology, and environmental projects have tended disproportionately to be women, queer, and two-spirit people. And I think that's because, to come back to feminist science studies, a lot of two-spirit, and we can talk about that in Q&A if people don't know what that term means, but two-spirit and queer people have also had some of the same critiques of hierarchies in science, because they and their bodies and communities have been viewed as deviant kind of scientific subjects to be studied. So very similar kinds of critiques of masculinist science that Indigenous people have. And so I've ended up working with my friend Maybrit Oman, who is a feminist in Sami. Sami are Indigenous people from what we now call Scandinavia. Working on climate change projects. She has looked a bit at histories of eugenics over there, because Sami were treated similarly to Indigenous peoples in North America. They were viewed as worthy of study. They were viewed as deviant. There were nation state programs designed to reduce their reproduction. They had their family systems disrupted in similar kinds of ways. So this is just a picture of some of the people that are working on a variety of projects. I work with we've worked with Cynthia Garcia Wyant, who works in California and over the Mexico border, who looks at human-corn relations and looks at the roles of women in facilitating the cultivation of corn and the sort of cultural roles of women in relationship to corn. And I'll come back and talk about that too, how culture, language, and managing natural resources, it's a terrible way to say it, but how those things are all interconnected for Indigenous people. And it's really important to keep them interconnected. So these are just some of the people that we're working with in that project. Let's go to the next slide, as I want to get to some basic terms and definitions. So I'm going to talk about the difference between, I think, what you call down there diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. We call it EDI up in Canada, but these ideas of diversity and inclusion. And I want to talk about this term indigenization as well. And I'm referring to an article that's really helpful. It's about the Canadian Academy and the way these terms are used up here, but they're used very similarly in the US. So it's still a good resource for people down there. And this article was written by first author's Adam Gaudry, who's a Métis scholar in my faculty. And they say they're drawing on Rauna Kokkonen here, who is a Sami scholar. I think Rauna is from Finland, I think so. And she's a feminist, a Sami feminist, and she says that conceptually indigenization represents a move to expand the academy's still narrow conceptions of knowledge to include Indigenous perspectives in transformative ways. So the key there is not only to include Indigenous perspectives, but to actually bring them into the academy and into our research in ways that actually transform what the academy looks like. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And then they move on to the term inclusion, because that's a word that we think a lot about in the university. And often that means, you know, I work with scientists, this idea of rainbowing up the lab, right? Let's have scholarships, let's have opportunities for women, for people of color, right? For diverse people. But just diversifying your laboratory or your field does not in and of itself change the way that you do science. It doesn't necessarily dismantle those historical kinds of hierarchies that make some people viewed as more capable of being objective and others viewed as more the typical kind of people who should be studied or on the receiving end of the scientific gaze. So what inclusion does is aim to increase the number of Indigenous or other diverse students in the academy. But what it's doing is often de facto asking us to adapt ourselves to a system versus the system adapting itself to us. And it's a system that was built on colonial violence at many levels. So let's go on to the next slide. So it's inclusion is mainly about access. Now in Canada, we use a term called reconciliation, which hasn't been used as much in the US. And that's because Canada had its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission, modeled in terms of its governance on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened, or the Truth and Reconciliation process that happened in South Africa. And so What I find in Canadian society is that non-Indigenous Canadians often have a very dictionary definition of what reconciliation means. And it's an important term up here because after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was led by an Indigenous Supreme Court judge, a very well-respected attorney and cultural person, there were a lot of other Indigenous people involved in that. And what they did was they had residential school or boarding school survivors come in and talk about their experiences in residential schools here, which involved emotional, physical, sexual abuse. And we are now, some of you may be aware because it's all in the news, uncovering unmarked graves of Native children in these schools throughout the 20th century that were operated by the Catholic Church and by the Canadian federal government. And there has been not exactly full disclosure of documents around those unmarked graves, both by the church and the feds. And so this whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission basically brought the victims, the children who survived these schools, in front of a commission, and they gave their testimony about the horrors they went through in these schools. And after the TRC happened, there was a call to action for all these sectors of Canadian society. Here's how education needs to respond. Here's how the business community needs to respond. Here's how media should respond, right? And they gave tangible calls to action for people to create change within the different sectors of Canadian society. So it's very involved, what was called for in Truth and Reconciliation. But your average Canadian thinks this: oh, it's restoring friendly relations. Can't we all just get along? But when you've got these histories of systemic violence and exclusion, it's not as easy as just letting bygones be bygones, forgetting the past, and can't we all just start with a clean slate? Truth and Reconciliation does not work that way. There's the idea of making one view or belief compatible with another. What if views and beliefs and histories are irreconcilable? So let's go to the next slide. So that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about reconciliation. So it's a much bigger project than that. I'm going to move to the next slide because I think I've already covered a lot of what's in here. So I want to talk about decolonization now, because to me, that's the next step. And so the projects I'm going to talk to you about have elements of inclusion. They have elements of reconciliation, but they also have elements of decolonization. So decolonization, I rely really, as do the authors of the article I was just citing, Gaudry and Lorenz, we rely heavily on Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang's article. This is open access. You can Google it and open it up. Decolonization is not a metaphor. And so we hear a lot of talk in the academy, decolonize your syllabus, which often to people means put more Black, Indigenous, women, and queer scholars on your syllabus. Don't just assign all the dusty old white guys in the canon, right? There's other people producing knowledge that have interesting perspectives on research. That can be part of decolonization, but what Tuck and Yang says, it's much harder than that. It's actually about returning what was stolen. And they talk about the return of land and life. And we hear this hashtag land back, give land back to the colonized, because that's what was taken: land, resources, and governance authority. And they also talk about the return of life. And that's what a lot of my work is concerned with. I kind of interpret the return of Indigenous life broadly, meaning the return of Indigenous research capacity, governance capacities. And so I kind of turn to this article to keep me on track about what I'm working towards as I broker research relationships between Indigenous communities and especially the Canadian Academy. So, yeah, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now. I'm going to get into examples for the rest of my talk, and I have about half an hour, I think. No, I have more like 15 minutes. Is that right, Mara? I'm going to go till 5:00. Can you weigh in and help me with the time here? Okay, maybe not. I'm going to go until 5:05, I think, my time. That's 7:05 your time. So I want to talk about this new project, which I have just gotten involved in. It's called the Aramat project, and I'm not one of the principal investigators on this. I'm one of the collaborators, so kind of another level of responsibility, which is fine with me. But one of the reasons I was brought into this new global initiative on Indigenous-led conservation is because of the summer genome training project I'll talk about after this slide that I have helped co-found both in the US and Canada. And we're now a US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia program with programs maybe starting in Mexico and South Africa to train Indigenous community members researchers and students in genome sciences, but particularly situated within a decolonial view of what that can look like. And so because we've been doing that summer training program for 10 years now, and it's been very successful in producing Indigenous genome scientists who are now coming into the leadership of that program, they're interested in Aramat, in this global conservation project, and having us do something around, say, environmental science. And so what has happened is the Canadian federal government has just awarded a $24 million grant to a group of 150 Indigenous organizations and researchers, some non-Indigenous allies as well. But I think about 70% of the collaborators and PIs involved in this project are Indigenous people, not only from Canada, but from around the world. And so what is happening is this 24 million has been awarded to this Aramat group, which is headquartered at the University of Alberta, but again, with partners all over the world. And we will fund, I think it's about, let me go to my notes here. I think we're going to be funding about 100 different projects around the world, Indigenous-led on-the-ground research projects in 70 different ecosystems. And so one of the things that this project is attempting to do is what I've attempted to do in my Indigenous genome training and research work, which is to recognize that Indigenous knowledge is any form of knowledge. This is my definition of it, any form of knowledge that ensures Indigenous thriving and survival. So often we are dished out this binary idea that you have Western science over here and Indigenous or traditional knowledge over here. And these are two different things. And maybe we can agree to get along with those two different things, but really Indigenous people do tradition and scientists do science, right? And there's this idea that there's kind of a divide there. And so we kind of push back against that in a couple of ways. First of all, we have Indigenous scientists involved in this project, but we also have Indigenous people with quote unquote traditional knowledge around language, people that have traditional medicinal knowledge, people that know the landscapes that Indigenous peoples have been caretaking for millennia. And we know it's common knowledge that much of the world's biodiversity is within Indigenous territories, remains within Indigenous territories. And so what we're attempting to do in the various research projects that will be funded within this broader program is the same thing we've been attempting to do in training Indigenous genome scientists, which is to recognize that it is really to our advantage as Indigenous peoples and as non-Indigenous peoples to work different scientific disciplines together with Indigenous forms of knowledge production. And the reason that Indigenous people are so interested in this is because they want a seat at the table. They want to, as I said, nations in part govern through science. And one of the ways for them to get a seat at policy-making tables is to have their own scientists, right, and their own scientific programs. But it doesn't mean that they are simultaneously de-emphasizing the knowledge that they often have in their traditional knowledge holding communities. And often we train Indigenous scientists who have both kinds of knowledge or access to both kinds of knowledge. And so that's kind of we're attempting to sort of democratize, right, these different forms of expertise and the kinds of projects that we're doing. So I'll give you a couple examples of the kind of projects that they're going to be, that they're already working on within Aramat. I can find my notes here. There's one a project in Peru where you've got Indigenous potato farmers who actually have a lot of knowledge that can be very helpful in terms of discovering, I don't like the word discover, but you know what I mean, figuring out what strains of potato will be most resilient in a world of climate change, right? And so there's an opportunity to do both lab-based science, but to also draw on the centuries of expertise that Indigenous peoples have carried down through their knowledge system. So that's one of the projects they're working on. I'm going to go to the next slide because I want to talk about SING, and then maybe we can come back to some of this in Q&A. So this is the main kind of training and education program that I've been involved in that really kind of puts all these ideas into practice. And it's going to serve as the template for us doing a more biodiversity focused science training program for Indigenous communities out in the field. And one of the things we want to do is the SING program, the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, has largely been a lab-based training program. And we fly Indigenous students into the University of Alberta, into into the University of Arizona, into the University of Illinois, where you've got all these high-tech, glitzy facilities. But one of the things we want to do is start using portable sequencing technologies and try to design a SING program where we can actually have Indigenous people stay where they are, and we will take the technology to them, because there's a real need to do this kind of work in the field. And I'll give you an example. We did a summer training program focused on chronic wasting disease a couple of years ago. And so we have Indigenous hunters and non-Indigenous hunters with a lot of knowledge about how chronic wasting disease affects the bodies of the cervids, so the deer, the elk, the moose that they are hunting and that they are in relation with. But what you have to do in order to look at chronic wasting disease or test for it is sever the head of the animal and send it into a lab. Hunters are not going to do that. So we're really interested. There are prion scientists who are looking at developing portable technologies that can be used in the field, because hunters are a form of community scientists, right? They have scientific knowledge through systematic observation over time. And so similarly, this summer, we're going to have what's called a land-back SING program, where we have Indigenous university students and community members and even postdocs who are going to work with these portable sequencing technologies that we're importing from a company called Oxford Nanopore over in the UK. And we're going to have them do soil sampling and look at soil microbiomes by using these portable sequencing technologies. And we'll have some people in the lab and some people out in the field. But we're doing this in order to help build that scientific capacity on a community level. And this is kind of the year, we can go to the next slide, where we'll segue into developing a program for the Aramat project as well, that's focused more on environmental science. Oh, this is just a map of where we are right now. We've got SING Canada, US, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And all of these programs are supported both by Indigenous communities, but also by funders of genome research in those countries. Genome Canada is our main supporter. Let's go to the next slide. So we really center a decolonizing. So remember those terms, indigenization, decolonization, we center those ideas in the way that we do genome training. So it's not only lab-based wet lab work that students do, but we also do a curriculum in decolonizing science and technology. And so they'll get some social theory related readings. And this is not something, a lot of our participants in the summer training program are in undergraduate or PhD programs in the biosciences. And they are, just because they're Indigenous, doesn't mean that they have a very robust understanding of the social theory behind decolonization either. Doesn't mean they've taken any post-colonial theory. We are trained in these real siloed ways in the university, right? And to do a PhD in genetics, it's a lot of work. They don't necessarily have a lot of time to do all of the kind of bioethical training that we in Indigenous community would like our scientists to do. And so one of the things we're trying to do is make up for that in our summer training program. So here you have a picture of 5 Indigenous scientists that are now moving into the leadership of the SING program in the US. You've got Katrina Claw there on the left, who is a PI, just opened up her first lab at the University of Colorado, Denver Health Sciences Center. Keolu Fox is there behind her. He's a Kanaka Maoli or Native Hawaiian genome scientist. Nani Garrison in the middle is another Diné or Navajo genome scientist. Navajo are overrepresented in STEM fields. And I think there's an interesting reason for that. Crystal Sosi is also Navajo, now at ASU, a geneticist. And on the right is Joe Iracheta, who's Purepecha, an Indigenous person from Mexico, who's does pharmacogenomic stuff. And so these Indigenous scientists started out in SING when they were PhD students, and now they're moving into leadership as they open up their own labs and have had the training on decolonial bioethics in our program. And the 2 older people on the left are actually community people from New Zealand, Maori people who are engaged in Indigenous governance in their community. They also come into the lab and participate in the program sometimes, so they can get a sense of what scientific culture is like. Because they're people who have to broker productive research relationships for Indigenous communities. And a lot of times this will involve subjecting your research plan to not only your university institutional review board that makes sure all of your ethics are appropriate, but also an Indigenous community research review board that makes sure that you're adhering to the Indigenous community's bioethical frameworks as well. And sometimes that involves signing a research contract with an Indigenous community when you're going to work on their lands or with samples from their populations. So we think a lot about governance alongside the science. It's not simply an add-on. These two things are really important and really go together in an important way. One of the things that I advocate is doing ethically driven research, meaning your ethical framework comes first, the governance framework comes first, and then what kind of research questions are you able to ask within that ethical framework? So let's go to the next slide. These are pictures of the Sing Canada group from the 2 years that we met in person. We were off in 2020 because of the pandemic. We met virtually last summer, and we're going to come back together this summer for the hybrid soil microbiome workshop, where some people will be at home and some people will be in Edmonton. And we had people mostly from across Canada, but we did have some participants from Australia as well as Mexico. We do some international exchange in our national programs, which is good for building an international Indigenous genome research community. And they're now engaged in these global projects as well. So one of the things young Indigenous researchers have really taken up is the notion of data sovereignty. So who's managing our data? Who has access to our data and our samples? And so they're really getting very much involved in the governance of science and of data. And in fact, there's a lot of Indigenous scientists you can follow on Twitter, but if you look at the hashtag data sovereignty or Indigenous data sovereignty, you can begin to find people to follow and look at the kind of workshops and papers that they're putting together on this front. Many of those people have come through the SING program since 2011. So it's a very exciting program. It's really helping build Indigenous research capacity, but with Indigenous people kind of coming to the fore and taking control, who are also rooted in their communities. And this is really important for making sure that we do ethical science, right? Let's go to the next slide, which might be a picture of SING US. And those are all the SING US cohorts. So SING US was founded in 2011. And then when I came to Canada in 2015-16, we ended up founding SING Canada. So they've done more cohorts down there, and they've moved across the country to different universities from year to year as different scientists within our network take the lead, because it's a big thing to organize. So next slide. And these are the workshop themes. And I think this is my last slide. So we did clam and conservation genomics. We have not only have different sites from year to year, but we also have different themes. And then we have different Indigenous communities involved on the ground and helping us put that workshop together. So we did chronic wasting disease in Alberta in 2019, because we've got a big prion research center here. You've got a lot of Indigenous hunters in Alberta and on the prairies involved in thinking about how to manage chronic wasting disease. And when we were at Simon Fraser outside of Vancouver, it was clam and conservation genomics, working with Indigenous people on the coast there who have a lot of long-term traditional knowledge and interest in the science around clam and conservation genomics. We do global meetings. And then, as I said, this year, we're going to do a land back session, and then do a salmon genomics that we're trying to get funding for back out in British Columbia in a couple of years. So I'm going to stop there, so we do have some time to get to questions. I know I covered a lot, and I could talk for 3 more hours on this stuff too. Was I good on time, Mara? You're muted.
Thank you for that.
We're always muted.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim TallBear. You were actually earlier, you had at least 3 or 5 more minutes.
Oh, okay. So
I was trying to
Q&A now.
Text you yes, which is actually probably great.
Okay, good. Yeah, sorry, I wasn't looking at chat. I'm sure there's all kinds of, I could have gone till 5:15. Okay.
You want?
No, well, let's go to the, I think, is this the last slide? I don't know if, it was the last slide. Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's anything just that I'm really excited to use this workshop template for the Aramat project, and think about, because when we do this summer training program for them, it will be out in communities in different locations around the world. And we've got people on pretty much every continent except Antarctica, Indigenous communities. So it'll be really interesting to see how these work out in the field. And the challenge will be designing summer training programs where we can be out in the field, right? In some of these places, of course, we'll do the typical kind of lab-based SING program, but in others, I mean, the point is really to not always privilege the metropolitan center, right? In this kind of training, and to recognize that we can combine land-based and local and traditional knowledges and ways of doing with what we consider more high-tech science. You can come back, Mara. I think I'm pretty much done. So
thank you.
Yes, I'm really excited to do that. So more than research, I'm going to be helping do this training program with Aramat.
Thank you
which might
so
mean
much.
to go to places I've never gone.
Thank you for such a wonderful talk and overview of a lot of real world transformations that are occurring. I've been seeing all the enthusiasm around the Aramat project, around we are hopeful to have things similar here in the United States, which brings me to one of the first questions that I saw in the Q&A, just to remind everyone, to remind the audience that please submit your questions to the Q&A. So one of the questions that was posted is, how can we, in the US, given that you are in one of the largest, or maybe the largest Native Studies program, how can we make our institutions more welcoming, not only higher ed, but also conservation institutions more welcoming for Indigenous hires? If you have any suggestion on that.
Hires for
hiring faculty,
yeah,
as well as in organizations.
You know, it is hard, right? It's hard, especially if you're in a part of the country where your university does not have solid, good relations with tribes. So tribe is the word you use in the US. We don't use that in Canada. And I do think, given that the places I've been, right? I did my degrees in Massachusetts and California. I'm from South Dakota and Minnesota. I've taught at Texas, Berkeley, Arizona State, and Alberta. So I've been in places where there's large Native populations and in places where there's almost none. And my experience has shown me that I personally, having grown up in Indigenous community, I have to be where there's a visible Native presence. It was very hard for me to do this work in Texas, and it was hard to do this work in Berkeley. There are a lot of California Natives, but they don't tend to be there, right? You have communities up in Northern California, around, you know, up near the Cal States up there. I have found it very difficult when an institution does not have good relations with Indigenous community. And I think it's really important. It may be hard to attract those hires until your institution makes a commitment to build those relationships with tribes in your area and whose traditional homelands you are in. And it's not easy to do. There's a lot of distrust there, right? Particularly certain institutions have a history of having unrepatriated remains of ancestors from people in that area and their collections, not great relationships with communities. So I think that's really important. And I think in a sense, I mean, it is kind of a chicken and egg thing, right? But it's hard to attract Indigenous faculty when when you're going to get there and the university is going to say, okay, now it's on you. Especially when you're an assistant professor, why is it on you? You're trying to get tenure. It can't be on you, right? To do that, there has to be a commitment on the part of administration, I think. And that's not really necessarily the answer everybody wants to hear, because how many administrations are going to make that commitment? So, yeah. So to make it more welcome, I mean, I think that's really key. And of course, we all know some of the key techniques are maybe cluster hires, right? Not just hiring one person and then putting everything on them. I also came to feel when I was at the University of California, Berkeley, they had a hard time keeping Indigenous faculty there. Part of it might have been the terrible cost of living in the Bay Area. It's terrible. But I think part of it was because it's so hard to live there. I really was advocating that they hire California natives who are from Northern California, because people who have historical commitments to that place, who have community, because it's so hard to live in the Bay Area because of the cost of living, that people that have community and family, and, you know, maybe a family home or, you know, land to go back to on the weekend, I think they'll tend to stay around more. So I think the degree to which you can, and it's hard because we don't have a lot of Indigenous scholars in our pipeline, I think it's important to focus on Indigenous people from your area, because Indigenous histories in different parts of the country are really different, and contact happened at really different times, which has profound effects on the way that tribes are culturally and governance wise in a contemporary era. So I'm from the Dakotas. I'm not a California native. I'm culturally, when I moved out there and lived in a native community there, actually, because my husband was the environmental director for a Pomo tribe on the coast. Whoa, so culturally different from where I come from. I was such a fish out of water on the coast of California because I'm a prairie person, right? And the same when I lived on the East Coast. You know, I lived in Boston for 7 years. Tribes in New England are super different than they are on the prairies. And I imagine the same is true in Virginia as well. And those histories are really different. So it's really important to respect those local and regional Indigenous histories and the degree to which you can focus on those relations and not take this pan-Native or pan-Indigenous approach to developing your programs. I think you can do both, right? You can do critical global Indigenous studies, but you need a local focus. For us, that's Cree and Métis, and then we still do some of the global stuff as well.
Thank you for that crucial suggestion. I was looking at both ways, critical Indigenous studies and the local. I'm going to read you a question from Anne Love. She is asking if the Aramat project is going to be funding various Indigenous-led conservation projects, or is it one project itself being funded and put into place? And if it is also a global project.
Right. So it's a really, it's strange. So the $24 million is being administered at the University of Alberta in combination with a couple of other universities that have the administrative capacity. But the goal is to give 70 to 80% of that money out to Indigenous communities, right? And so, yes, they're hoping to fund up to 150 Indigenous organizations and communities to do work around the world. And so it will be work where PIs are working with local researchers and collaborators. And people are, it's not only people in community, but it's also people in universities and other parts of the world as well. One of the PIs, the reason that Aramat, which is a word from Tuareg, it's from the Indigenous language of Tuareg people in Mali and let's see, Algeria, Libya, around that area. One of the PIs is a Tuareg woman, and so it is very global in its scope. And so, but yeah, the money will be divided up and given to projects all over the world. But administered at the U of A. It takes so much. That's the other thing that makes it hard for Indigenous people to do this work sometimes. The administrative, and you know this, right, as researchers, the bureaucratic hoops you have to jump through to manage this kind of money is really difficult. I, even as a senior professor at the University of Alberta, do not have the administrative capacity to manage a project like this. So let alone people in community. It's really, it's a problem.
Thank you. Someone is also asking if you could talk more about the goals of the various kinds of science that are intersecting here in your talk and how those affect the actual work. This person gets the impression that colonial science is often about extracting and possessing knowledge as a resource that can be used to dominate life forms, while Indigenous sciences tend to approach science in a more relational, possibly more mutual way. Is this a paradigm at all accurate or relevant? And did you get the question? It's a long one.
I think so. I was thinking about the work of a couple of my graduate students who are probably going to be working as research assistants within some of the Aramat research projects. And so as the kind of goals for the kind of science that we like to facilitate and promote. So one of them is a Métis graduate student named Arlana Bennett, who works on chronic wasting disease. And one of the things that she's been attempting to do is advocate for the knowledges of Indigenous and non-Indigenous hunters in Alberta. People who have intimate knowledge of the way that chronic wasting disease is moving from I think it's moving from, I forget now, from between deer and elk, but they're worried about it moving up into caribou populations in the north with climate change as ecozones move north. And caribou are central to Indigenous cultures in the Arctic, right? Central. And so these recommendations about how many meals of meat you can have per month or whatever about chronic wasting disease, that goes out the window when you're talking about a people for whom these cervids are central to their lifeways, right? This is what they eat. This is how they clothe themselves. Their relationship with these animals has been central to the rise of their cultures through history. So it's really different stakes for them than, say, a hunter who just wants to go out and, gets an elk permit and wants to go out and hunt once a year. And so you have to really, we're trying to figure out, like, how can you manage chronic wasting disease in ways that are not only going to protect the animal, right, and their populations, but are going to make sure that you're not having this negative effect on the indigenous peoples whose lives are co-constituted with these animals, right? And they should be involved in the way that this research is happening, say at the University of Alberta. And so she's been working on that. And what you will have researchers who are, in theory, really interested in indigenous or local knowledge of hunters, but they don't have the same relationship to the animal, right? This is scientifically interesting to them. And it is really scientifically interesting. But there's something in addition to that when you live in intimate relation with a population of animals, when it's central to your culture and your way of clothing yourself, right? And your sense of your whole human health, your emotional and physical and mental health, right? The health of these animals is central to that. So it really, there's different stakes for people. And so the hunters as well in the communities are interested in the kind of science the prion researchers are doing, but they also have different stakes. And that will really shape, I think, the way that you, like, for example, they might have a huge stake in portable technologies, right? Because they want to participate in the monitoring of these populations. I've also got another graduate student who's working, well, I guess I can talk about an array of projects in a broader sense. One of the things I've found with different Indigenous communities in Alberta and different graduate students who are all Indigenous, who are largely working on natural resource management, is there is a real desire to do scientific field work and laboratory analysis, but always keeping in mind that they also want to revitalize language at the same time. So they want to figure out, how can we do like field work where we're also doing language revitalization, where we're also paying attention to the ethnobotanical knowledge of some of our elders and traditional knowledge. Like, they want to do all of these things at once. And that really defies the disciplinary silos in the academy too. So you've got scientists who might be really interested in the scientific questions that the communities are interested in, but they're not necessarily interested in, nor are they qualified to think about language revitalization, right? So you need this real multidisciplinary team from the academy to be working with communities as well. So there's, I don't know if that's really an answer to that, but all of the projects seem to have language revitalization, respect for traditional knowledge about medicines in the land, as well as a deep interest in the kind of Western science. And they want all of that together in these projects that they're working on.
Sounds wonderful. I'm going to ask you a third question. Hopefully we have time for one more.
Okay. I'm being very loquacious. I'm sorry. Perfect. I'm not concise today.
No, it's great. Questions are complex always. Could you provide us with an example from your collaborations of how Indigenous knowledges are transforming mainstream conservation science? I don't know if you know of a particular example on this.
That's a really good question. I wish one of my co-PIs from Aramat was here to talk about that, because I've been working more on the genomic stuff lately. Yeah, can I give that a pass?
Definitely. Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
It's something we are probably going to explore in some of our courses with the land back movement and so on. And
yeah, I'm trying to think of the kind of genome stuff we've been working on and what our young scientists are working on right now. Often they pursue different sorts of questions because their historical framework is viewing something as they might have a different take on what constitutes a problem. So there's one younger Indigenous genome scientist. So he worked with us in Sing about 7 or 8 years ago now, but I remember him working on, he's really interested in corn and looking at the migration of corn strains through the Americas. But what he was interested in, it was coming from a really different perspective than the human population geneticists who were non-Indigenous. He was really interested in tracing the migration of corn because it showed the relationships of Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, not migrations into the Americas, but movement and trade networks around the Americas. So he wasn't really coming from this kind of immigration, centering an immigration narrative into the Americas. He was centering Indigenous relationality in the Americas, right? And that's a really different historical perspective. This sort of understanding that, of course, there were networks, of course, people were moving around and developing different corn strains, and there were societies and civilizations doing all of this interesting scientific work. That's a really different historical set of assumptions than the historical set of assumptions that non-Indigenous human population geneticists have. So that's one example, not related to conservation, but how Indigenous scientists ask really different questions. And on the surface, it might not seem so radical, but it's based on radically different sets of historical understandings. So.
Thank you. Someone else is asking, someone was asking about something you mentioned about the two spirits, and someone else asking also about age and spirituality as part of ideas that thinking, how are these two topics related to your discussion, age and spirituality?
Age, did it say age?
Age and spirituality.
Age like AGE?
Yes, like,
oh, I don't,
you being young or being older, I guess, like in terms of diversity, inclusion, and decolonization.
oh, elders. They're interested in the role of elders in the work.
Probably.
Okay, I see somebody put elders there.
Also, like TwoSpirit.
TwoSpirit, yeah. So one of the, so if you don't know, TwoSpirit means, like, when in Canada, we don't only say LGBTQ, we'll say 2S quite often on the end. And TwoSpirit is a pan-native term that I think was actually the history of it is, it was a term that was sort of, it has deeper roots, I think, in Algonquin languages, but it's comes out of this 1990 meeting of, this is going to sound antiquated, but I think it was a 1990 meeting of Indian gays and lesbians. So all older terminology, but there's, so there are a lot of Indigenous people now, not a lot, but I mean, many more who would identify as TwoSpirit now, or 2S. And so TwoSpirit can mean many different things, right? They might also be people who would identify as LGBTQ, or they might be people who would also identify within kind of different, we don't have gender binaries in a lot of Indigenous communities. Historically, there are more gender roles than two. And so it's kind of recognition that traditionally there were these multiple gender roles that one could live as. And so one of the things that we've noticed, again, as I was saying earlier, is that I think a lot of critics of, we share a lot in common with queer and TwoSpirit critiques of science, right? Because their communities and bodies have been viewed as deviant and worthy of scientific research as compared to the norm. And the norm, of course, is a very biased norm. The assumption that everybody, that most people, if they're normal, are living within a sex gender binary. Most people, if they're normal, are heterosexual, right? There are these ideas out there about what the norm is. And even if we accept not the norm as not problematic, we are still deciding what the norm is, right? And so I'm quite clear what the question was exactly, but I found that there are a lot of similar kinds of critiques of mainstream science that are coming out of these different communities. And so I have disproportionately encountered queer and TwoSpirit scientists who are really kind of on board with the decolonial science work that we're doing. And I think it's because they're seeing these problems in different areas as well. But I can't remember exactly what the wording of the question was, though. I'm sure it was more specific than that.
I think it's a great answer. It was a bit difficult to understand the question as well when I read it.
Yeah, sometimes you have to just sit there a while and talk.
I think we can have time for one more last question. I apologize that we do not have time to all of them. We have like 2 minutes remaining. I am sorry for all of the great questions we received. So we want to finish with one last question. What makes you hopeful for a more just future?
I'm trying to think of something not cliched. One of the things that's been really, and this might get back to the last question, one of the things that's really held me to account is, and I don't want to be like one of those old people who says young people are the future. Like, I don't want to be like that at all. Because a lot of young people are really not very hopeful, I think. They're not facing, I think, the world of possibilities I thought I was facing 35, 40 years ago. It's a very different world they're facing. But though the people that I have learned the most from in the last 10 years have been, again, young, queer, and Two-Spirit Indigenous people who have really connected the violence to people, like sexual violence, particularly looking at missing and murdered Indigenous women, with violence to the land. And they're very clear that these forms of violence are related. So look at all the sexual violence that you find around oil and gas facilities and man camps, right? You find terrible violence to the earth along with violence to women and children. And they have been very clear that these things are related. And so that to me, and a disproportionate number of them have been people who reject the gender binary, they reject heteronormativity. And so there's an inherent understanding that these binaries are always hierarchical, whether it's nature culture, whether it's human animal, right? Whether it's man woman, that you cannot have these binaries without having one placed above the other in a way that is incredibly oppressive and ultimately violent. And they kind of embody that understanding of the world in the activism and in the theoretical work that they do. And so when I look at a lot of these activists, right, like at Standing Rock, you had disproportionately a lot of queer, Two-Spirit, and women at the lead of these movements. And I think that comes from their implicit theoretical understanding of the problem with these kinds of binaries and these hierarchies of life that are embedded in science and that are embedded in the disciplines more broadly. And so I really do look to them a lot and how they're thinking and talking about things in my own work. So that gives me hope that people in community are thinking on that level, and they are some of our greatest theorists, and many of them are not in the academy.
Thank you so much for those hopeful words at the end as well. Not cliche at all. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Kim TallBear, for such a wonderful and inspiring talk for all of us. Thank you to the audience for being with us tonight as well. I want to remind you also that you can follow Kim TallBear. She is very up loud as well. She participates in media, including Media Indigena, Indigenous Science, Technology, and Society, and you can follow her as well on Twitter at Kim TallBear. You can capture the slides. I also want you to remind you that you can follow us in following events and follow the speaker series and follow the Institute for Integrated Conservation in all those links as well. Thank you very much, everyone, for such a wonderful talk and event tonight.
Thank you.